Well, there's my sick brain in action right there. I forgot to put us back on right away. Thanks for coming into Exploring Reality and checking out this debate. I'm super thankful for everybody that's coming here early to watch this. Make sure to like the video, like the stream, and share it around so we can get these guys the love that they deserve. Um, we got Kyle and Ceasetoknow here. We're going to be debating the probability of theism versus atheism. And before I kind of ask Kyle and Cease to introduce themselves, if I sound kind of wiry, it's because I'm a little under the weather. So sorry about that. And just as a reminder, every little view, every little sub, all that stuff helps out the channel and the ministry. And if you guys saw that our financial goals for the year, I'm trying to get to a point where we can actually break even and I don't have to put in a bunch of extra work at a part-time job to keep this ministry afloat. So please consider becoming a Patreon supporter. If you have questions about how that money gets sorted out and how it gets used or anything like that, feel free to shoot me an email. Yeah. In the meantime, now we're going to transition to kind of introducing our panelists here. So we'll start with Ceasetoknow. Why don't you introduce yourself? Thanks for being here.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it. Yeah, so I have a degree in philosophy. I'm currently completing my master's degree in philosophy. I host a YouTube channel called Axioms on Trial, where we discuss philosophy, science, religion, politics. Have different scholars and experts on for interviews, sometimes debates, things of that nature. I am an agnostic atheist. I'm open to hearing new arguments, new evidence. I just haven't found anything that that's been convincing to me so far. So my primary interest in philosophy is philosophy of mind, philosophy of language, phenomenology. I tend to lean more the continental side of things, but I would say my interests are pretty much in between analytic and continental. So besides that, I often go live on TikTok. My username there is Ceasetoknow. And I do lives pretty much covering the same topics as I do on my YouTube channel. And that's about it. Oh, I think you're still muted.
Man, like I said, it's that sick brain in action. Kyle, most of the people that... Thanks, by the way, Ceasetoknow. Kyle, most of the people that know who I am know who you are, just because we're really similar. But why don't you just kind of give everybody a rundown of who you are?
Yeah, so my name's Kyle Alander. I run the Christian Idealism YouTube channel. I also recently brought back my blog, so I'm going to post a lot of things on there, so look out for that. I am currently an undergraduate in philosophy, so I haven't graduated yet, but I have about a year left, and I specialize in the philosophy of science, as that's what I study, both in my free time and in academic settings. And so, yeah, that's basically what my specialty is. And then when it comes to like philosophy of religion, philosophy of mind, those are my other two main areas of focus. Not so much philosophy of language. I actually haven't got into that field, so I'm probably not going to speak too much on that today, but that's what I do. Another thing too is, I do consider myself a, Christian apologist, even if that term is kind of, looked down upon. I prefer the term Christian philosopher, but it is what it is. And right now, my current projects have been just focusing on the explanatory structure of theism, and I hope to, with my presentation today, I hope to get into that and what that looks like.
Awesome. Thanks, Kyle. All right. So, like we said, today is about whether or not theism is more probable than atheism. Kyle, you have the affirmative. Do you want to share your slides? And then the structure for the day for everybody that's listening, 20-minute opening statements. I think we said 10-minute rebuttals. And then we have a very soft 40-minute open discussion idea is the idea, but we'll just see how it goes. It'll be longer or shorter depending on how the conversation goes. And then we're going to have a Q&A at the end. We'll prioritize super chats, and you guys can put your super chats at the end. If you have questions during the debate as well, if you just do the @exploring reality, it'll get highlighted for me, and then I can just kind of save it and put it to the side for our Q&A session as well. So that'll be really helpful. Kyle, I'm gonna put Cease down. I'll put you up, and then as soon as you just start talking, I'll start the timer. Sound good?
Yep.
Cool.
Okay. Here's the full slideshow. So before I begin, I want to highlight where I think the core issue is. And I kind of hinted at this in my last debate with Eric Mackey, but this also applies here. So I think the core issue on whether God exists or not is going to come down to two things. Number one, what's your epistemology? And number two, what's your axiology? Everything else, whatever, evidences are going to be for or against theism is going to be 100% determined by those two factors. And so hopefully I can make that point clear in this presentation today. So this is the table of contents for what the presentation is going to be. I'm going to start off with the structure of Bayesian epistemology, the logical structure of the explanation, the theoretical constraints of theism, and so on and so forth. So let's start off with the structure of Bayesian epistemology. So I am assuming an explanationist framework of epsilon probability. And for the purposes of clarity, I will be assuming what's called the positive relevance view of evidence. And this view says that E is evidence for H if and only if the probability of H conditional on E is greater than the probability of H. That is, if and only if E, which is our evidence, raises the probability of H above what it was when E was not taken into account. Now, of course, a critical aspect of evaluating hypotheses is the concept of what I call probabilistic degrees of support. Degrees of support are mind-independent support relations between propositions. These represent objective relationships between propositions, offering a structure to determine how one proposition, such as certain evidence, probabilistically supports another proposition, such as some hypothesis that one may have. When a hypothesis makes a prediction, this is simply just a way of talking about a probabilistic degree of support of the hypothesis and the evidence. Now, of course, another thing that's going to be crucial to my case is that these relationships are atemporal. The value of a conditional probability, like the probability A conditional on B, is not influenced by the timing of discovering or understanding A and B. Evidential support is quantified as epicenter probabilities, which are essentially just degree of support between propositions. Furthermore, as I'm going to hopefully we'll get into this in the dialogue, I'm basically saying that this exact same structure applies to science. So we have what's called our theoretical posits, which are essential for theorizing. We try to explain our observations, which is the data, by positing things that are unobservable, which we can call, i.e., theoretical. These elements represent propositions that can have evidential relationships. Now, in the explanationist model, basic probabilities are defined by the probabilities of atomic propositions conditional on propositions that are directly explanatorily prior to them. And so I'll be assuming this definition of basic probability. The probability of X conditional on Y and Ni is basic if X is atomic and Y is a conjunction of values for all parties of X in a Bayesian network that, according to Ni, includes all variables immediately explanatory prior to X and correctly relates all the variables it includes. In other words, we could say that basic probabilities are atomic propositions conditional on potential direct explanations rather than them just being the unconditional probabilities of complete worlds. So here is how it would apply to theism. So I take theism to be the proposition that there is an omnipotent being that acts on the basis of axiological reasons. Here, I understand an omnipotent being as just a being with perfect freedom of will and perfect efficiency of will. And of course, God's will is guided by the entire axiological domain. Hence, God is not only biased towards moral goods, but he wants to pursue all the categories of goodness, which include moral, alethic, and aesthetic. Finally, our theory of best actions, or what a best action is, will be influenced by this axiological domain, since best actions incorporate all values in this analysis. So the structure of these explanations is actually fairly straightforward. First of all, stage one, we identify a value theory and axiology about what a best action is, and then we go to stage two, which is you combine theism, or a proposition about theism, with your proposition about the axiology, and then you confirm them both with the evidence via a confirmation holism. And again, we can get more into that in our dialogue, what exactly confirmation holism is. So in this structure, all theistic explanations have the same structure, and that structure can be applied across all data. A theodicy is a theistic explanation of the specific data of evil and suffering, but the structure of a theodicy is identical, again, identical to the structure of all theistic explanation. The reason for this is that all theistic explanations are structures because God is all good, and thus there is a probability of one, or at least a very, 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 very high degree of probability that he does best actions. Thus, anything that we can identify within our stage 1 can be easily transferred to stage 2 as long as we find evidence that matches with what those conjunctions predict. In this way, stage 1 is a way to screen off all disconformatory evidence against theism, and stage 2 is a way to confirm theism and our value theory with the tools of confirmational holism. And so here we see that all of God's actions are axiological. Thus, it is through this axiological lens that I shall be viewing the evidence for and against theism. So here's how it would apply within the explanationist framework. In explanationism, the basic probability of theistic explanation is defined as the probability of T conditional on E and AI, where T represents theism, E is the empirical evidence, and AI is the auxiliary axiological assumption, our value theory. This framework allows us to evaluate how likely theism is given the evidence and given our specific axiological assumption, thereby assessing the explanatory power of theism within different philosophical assumptions about what is valuable. And so here's basically just Bayes' theorem, or some sort of modified version of Bayes' theorem. Thus, on this theorem, we can say that every prediction of theism includes an expanded element, since those expansions include assumptions about value. The variable AI, representing the auxiliary axiological assumption, has a significant impact on the antecedent likelihoods of what theism predicts. And again, we can get more into that later. So here are the kind of theoretical constraints of what theism is. So here's the first principle, which I call the falsification principle. And this is, an applied version of the falsification principle is going to be what I call the ultimate goodness principle. So the ultimate goodness principle stipulates that a state of affairs S can be essentiated by God if and only if S permanently bears the axiological status of being good of the whole at some time t. This principle serves as a crucial constraint on theistic actions and predictions, dictating that any divine action or anything that God does must ultimately align with this principle, or just with goodness. Now, of course, theistic hypotheses, when conjoined with various axiological theories, must align with the ultimate goodness principle. Predictions, evidence, or value theories that conflict this ultimate goodness principle are considered evidence against theism, and thus the probability of T conditional on A and I, and the probability of our evidence conditional on theism and the axiology will be decreased substantially. Now, of course, with the falsification principle, we also have the reverse of that, which is the confirmation principle. So this is the confirmation principle. It's basically just what I call the axiological relevance thesis. So this thesis asserts that theism predicts an observation if there is an axiological relevance connecting theistic propositions, so propositions about theism, to propositions about the observation. This thesis establishes a framework for confirming theistic hypotheses based on their relevance to observed phenomena. So here's kind of two ways to look at it. You have the probability of observation conditional on theism be equal to the probability of observation conditional on theism and evidence, or you could just say that the probability of our observation conditional on theism and evidence is greater than the probability of that observation conditional on theism and not observing the evidence. So how does the evidence actually confirm theism on this framework? Well, here's one way to look at it. Let E represent some value state. Let E star some disvalue state. Let T represent theism and not T, or represent the negation of theism. So here, the probability E conditional on T is greater than the probability of E conditional on not T, or we could say in the reverse, the probability of E star conditional on not T is greater than the probability of E star conditional on T. And again, here's the kind of formal way to look at it. So you have theism conjoined with your axiology, which then makes predictions. So, of course, the evidence can be wide, of course, because I'm not going to focus anything in particular for this debate. We can talk more generally about what the evidence for theism is going to be, but all theistic evidence is going to be axiological in nature. And so here are some examples we could look at. So we have aesthetic virtue, or values, so like contingency, a complex public universe, nomic laws, cosmological fine-tuning, beauty, vastness. That would represent the alethic domain. Then the moral domain, which is consciousness, moral awareness, psychophysical harmony, sainthood, religious experiences, and alethic, scientific discoverability, rational disagreements, and then finally just learned experiential truths, right? Now, in short, the idea here is that I'm not going to focus on any particular piece of data, but rather we can take any piece of data and show an increase in theism probability by having the probability of E conditional on T and AI be greater than the probability of not E conditional on T and AI. Of course, this only works if we make all the evidence axiological, given the axiological relevance thesis, but this is how you would show evidence for theism in the sense that you increase the probability of one's hypothesis. So now I'm going to get into what I call transitive natural theology here. So with transitive natural theology, we can situate all states of affairs, all of our data, within an S-type world. So here I define an S-type world as a world ensemble of a protological and eschatological good wholes. Now, of course, it is well known that probabilistic support is not transitive, at least more generally. However, it can be demonstrated that probabilistic support becomes transitive when the intermediate proposition effectively screens off the original evidence with respect to the hypothesis in question. Now, consider these propositions. You have X, which is good states of affairs, or good states, or axiological relevance, Y, which is our S worlds, and then T, which is theism. Now, of course, let's assume that S world is evidence for theism, meaning the probability of S world of S conditional on T is greater than the probability of S conditional on not T. In this scenario, the intermediate proposition S world supports the final proposition theism. Now, of course, suppose Y, S world, screens off X with respect to T. So here's the formula. And again, we can get more into this in our discussion, but here's basically just the proof of the transitivity formula. Now, this formula basically, in a nutshell, suggests that if an S world is already known to occur, it is unreasonable to allow good states or axiological relevance to affect the probability that God exists. Similarly, if it is already known that S world does not occur, then good states or axiological relevance should not affect the probability that God exists, as a lack of S world is sufficient for theistic disconfirmation, which is, in this case, evidence against theism. Now, of course, this implies that the representational content of S world screens off the evidence of good states or axiological relevance with respect to theism. Therefore, if good states or axiological relevance probabilistically supports S world, and S world in turn probabilistically supports theism, then by transitivity, good states or axiological relevance probabilistically supports theism. Now, why is this important? Well, an S world includes all the data that supports theism and any potential evidence against theism, right? Because any evidence against theism would be situated within an S-type world narrative or story. This allows, in this case, for theological stories to play out that makes evidence like evil, divine hiddenness, religious disagreements, or any of the other data points that atheists want to bring up to have more context. And so it allows for potential theological stories that can explain this evidence within a theistic theological story. And therefore, this would screen off the disconfirmation that those pieces of evidence that the atheist would try to bring would bring. And so anything with axiological relevance serves as confirmation of us living in an S-type world, which then supports theism. So that's the idea. So that's why, for this presentation, I'm not focusing too much on the evidence against theism, because I think this overall framework screens off everything, at least that it needs to. So here's kind of two arguments for theism I want to present. First, I'm going to start off with the S-world argument, and then I'll get into my second argument. So here are the terms. Again, just my definition of theism. We represent K, which is our total available background evidence. Then we have S worlds, which is a world ensemble of protological and eschatological good wholes. Now, of course, there's other factors I want to bring into the table. So here are three factors. X, creatures receive no compensation for their earthly life or afterlife for their negative experiences. Y, creatures do not defeat their negative experiences either in this earthly life or the afterlife. And Z, value-bearing objects do not at some time T become permanently good on the whole. Sorry for the typo there. So here's the argument in a nutshell, and I'll go over each premise briefly. It is a probability 1 that God will perform a best action where there is one. Premise 2, the creation of F worlds is a best action. Premise 3, therefore, it is a probability 1 that God will instantiate a token of an S world. Premise 4, S-type worlds will entail the absence of XYZ factors, the factors I just went over earlier. Premise 5, the absence of XYZ factors is evidence in favor of S-type worlds. And so 6, the probability of the absence of XYZ factors given theism is equivalent to the probability of theism. And of course, in this case, we're talking about K, which is just our background knowledge. Premise 7, if God exists, God will insert a token of an S world. This follows, again, from just the first 3 initial premises I laid out earlier. So here's where the transitivity comes in. All evidence E that imply the absence of XYZ factors are tokens of S-type worlds, denoted as E star. Therefore, all E stars probabilistically supports the existence of S-type worlds. 10, S-type worlds probabilistically supports theism. Therefore, all E stars probabilistically supports theism. And here we could just understand E stars as just being anything, either anything that doesn't align with those factors, or anything that is a protological or eschatological good whole within the world. So that's the first argument. Here's the final argument I want to present, and then I'll close off my opening statement. So I'm going to, instead of laying out the argument, I'm going to go over kind of the key premises, and then I'll lay out the argument near the end. So here's the first premise. Omnitheism is at least as intrinsically probable as its competitors. Now, of course, here I am treating theism's competitors as types. So here I can represent kind of 3 grand metaphysical theories. Number 1 is, of course, theism. Number 2 would be naturalism. Now, again, I don't know which view Ceasetoknow holds to, but anyway, so these are the other kind of hypotheses that he might hold to. Either naturalism, which states that there is only non-normative, non-intentional substances and laws governing change, and then axiarchism, which states that there is a fundamentally normative but non-intentional principle or substance, or whatever you want to call it, governing creation and change. So these grand theories are basically, that's going to encompass the entire probability space. Now, to support premise 1, the debate around intrinsic probability is controversial, given that epicenter probability is relative to evidence, right? So it's going to be really difficult to test whether the intrinsic probability of theism, when we lack evidence to conditionalize on, right? But here's the solution, or potential solution. Under the explanationist model, the intrinsic probability will be determined either by one's higher order theory of simplicity or the principle of indifference. Now, of course, if we go with some kind of higher order theory of simplicity, then we can use Occam's laser, which concerns itself with, in this case, would concern itself with fundamental entities rather than entities total. And so because God would be the only entity with one property, omnipotence, then it would have at least a higher intrinsic probability than its negation. Now, of course, maybe you reject that. Maybe you don't think simplicity is relevant, right? In that case, we go with the indifference principle. If we go with indifference, then we end up with Ted Posson's view, which is that the intrinsic probability is 1/3. Now, of course, I do not hold to any of these views. I just want to make that clear. I don't necessarily hold, because I think there's still reasonable debate on that. But I think regardless of which view we hold to, omnitheism is at least as intrinsically probable as its competitors. So here's the second premise of the argument. The total evidence, excluding the data of axiological relevance and or protological eschatological good wholes, does not favor omnitheism's competitors over omnitheism. Now, of course, I would say that this premise is true in virtue of the fact that the only evidence that could favor theism's competitors is evidence that entails that some things are bad on the whole, or we could say that they never eschatologically become good on the whole. However, given our place of not observing what the future would look like, we have not seen any confirmed evidence that there is something that is bad on the whole relative to the theistic narrative of some S-world. Here's premise 3. Given the total evidence, excluding the data of axiological relevance and or protological eschatological good wholes, the data of axiological relevance and or protological good wholes strongly favors omnitheism over its competitors. Now, I would say that this premise is true given our overall framework of theistic predictions that I outlined earlier, and especially given the axiological relevance thesis. Once we understand that theism predicts with a much higher degree of probability that than its competitors of the existence of protological and eschatological good wholes, then I would say that that's really strong evidence for theism. And I would say that, of course, competitors do not have the same amount of confirmation because they lack omnipotence, and so cannot guarantee an axiologically guided teleological outcome. What that basically means is because they don't posit omnipotence in their frameworks, then you're not going to, even if you do have a hypothesis that tries to parrot what theism says, you're not going to be able to match theism in terms of explanatory power due to it not guaranteeing the outcome. And so here's the kind of my final argument. Premise 1, Omnitheism is at least as intrinsically probable as its competitors. Premise 2. The total evidence, excluding the data of axiological relevance and or protological eschatological good holes, does not favor omnitheism's competitors over omnitheism. Premise 3. Given the total evidence, excluding the data of axiological relevance and or protological eschatological good holes, the data of axiological relevance and or protological eschatological good holes strongly favors omnitheism over its competitors. So here's the conclusion. Omnitheism is many times more probable than its competitors, which then leads to premise 4, which is that omnitheism's competitors are very probably false. Therefore, my conclusion is that omnitheism is very probably true. And that is basically my entire opening statement. So I can see my time.
Why does it do that? Good job. You were over. We, for the audience, we already talked about this beforehand, but we were finding somebody went over for a little bit. You only went over by like 15 seconds. So
okay, that's good. I was like, I hope it wasn't too much.
Plus 10. No, I'm just kidding. So awesome. Thank you for that, Kyle. Audience, again, if you have questions, which I'm sure you do, just again, remember to @ me in the comments or leave a super chat with the question. We'll save them for the end. Cease, are you ready?
Yeah, can you guys hear me okay?
Yep. I'm going to put you up and then everybody else down, and I'll start the timer as soon as you start talking.
Sure. So firstly, I want to thank you, Stan, for organizing this debate. I want to thank Kyle for being here tonight to do this with us. And I want to thank the audience for taking their time out of their lives to listening to us converse tonight. So one thing I want to say is that something I've learned in my many years of engaging in this kind of conversations and debates is that specific arguments for God's existence or non-existence tend to not be very useful. This is because at some point, both sides are going to deny and not accept some premise expressed by the opponent. What I've come to believe is more fruitful, and which I think is what's happening here, is to do a worldview comparison and to refer to standards of epistemic virtues as expressed in philosophy, then figure out whether we agree on these virtues, if we even care about the same things, and if we seek the same kind of virtues in our epistemology. So I will list some of these virtues, and my opponent here mentioned some of these in the conversation. I just fail to see why he thinks that theism succeeds in embodying these virtues better than naturalism. So the first virtue is explanatory power. Explanatory power is the usefulness of a hypothesis in making sense of the reality of some phenomena or relationship between phenomena. The second is predictive power. Predictive power being the capacity of a theory to generate testable, novel predictions. This is important because not only does it explain something observable, but it also generates something new that further expands our understanding of reality. The third is unification, the capacity for one explanation to explain a wide data set. The fourth is simplicity, which we heard in Kyle's opening statement, which is that if everything else is equal in competing theories, we should refer and we should prefer the theory that invokes fewer entities, more simple features and less ontologies. We should prefer the theory which makes the least amount of assumptions, because the more complex the ontologies, the more the assumptions, the less likely it is that their view is going to accurately correspond to reality. In other words, simplicity is good because a simpler view is more probable and less likely to end in contradictions. Which leads me to the last virtue, which is consistency. A view is preferable when it's consistent with itself and not logically fallacious. That is self-explanatory, really. Now, my view, in contrast with Kyle's view, as we heard in the last 20 minutes, is that naturalism and atheism and physicalism all meet these virtues far better than theism does. When it comes to explanatory power, it seems to me that naturalism explains all the data better. For example, it can explain morality by understanding the nature of consciousness in relation to suffering and flourishing, without reducing morality to God's nature which is unobserved, or God's commandments, which reduces morality to mere authority and power. It can explain the structures and functions that we see in nature without assuming design. It can explain evil by understanding destructive biological drives, as opposed to running into the problem of evil from the religious perspective, which I will get back to in just a minute. He mentioned in his opening fine-tuning. Life being a rare event, I would say, is not good evidence of a creator. I think that's kicking the can down the road. We can always ask, why is God's nature the way that it is, as opposed to being some other nature? And if you don't think that this question requires a tuner, then neither does the universe. Theism also creates what in philosophy is called the mind-body problem, which is that if the mind and soul are of a different substance than the physical, then how are the two capable of interacting with one another in the first place? In terms of unification, God is not a simpler explanation, the way that Kyle expressed, because actually you're assuming more aspects and dispositions that are being accounted for. You're assuming more ontologies. You're assuming that somehow the mind is separate in some sense from the physical, whereas what we have empirical priors for in our observations is that when you damage physical brains, something about conscious experience seems to be lost. And so the idea that somehow you could have this consciousness apart from some physical configuration seems to be problematic and creating more questions than it actually answers. So going back to the problem of evil, for example, the problem of evil is a real challenge to the view that if there is a perfect, all-loving, and all-powerful being, that we would see the kind of evil that we see in the world. If this being existed, by definition, it couldn't fail in his intentions if he is supposed to be all perfect, which means he couldn't create something imperfect. So if God does create that, and does create the circumstances that lead to evil, and could stop that evil, but does not, then in what sense is he all-loving or all-powerful? The atheist is not going to be satisfied with the answer that ultimately God has his reasons, and that his wisdom trumps all, because that is precisely what's in question. Appealing to mystery is not helpful and a problem for the theistic worldview. Theism also does not produce novel predictions the way that the scientific method does, which I think is another way in which naturalism is clearly superior as a framework. When Kyle says that theism has more explanatory power, I fail to see how this is the case. All that I see is that the theistic perspective has no way to show for itself that it isn't purely speculative. I mean, he was mentioning in his opening statement probability. Well, I don't understand how you can apply a probability for something that lacks empirical priors. I understand a probability in a mathematical and scientific context, which is we have empirical priors and we do an analysis of those empirical priors, and then we can apply a probability in some kind of concrete way. The theistic perspective seems to me to be a way to define God into existence, and I don't see that as successful. Everything that, I don't have to deny the possibility of a God existing or claim that it's impossible for the laws of nature to be suspended or anything like that. All I could say is that we have psychological explanations that I think that have empirical priors, that have a concrete grounding, that better explain why it is that people have so-called religious experiences. By the way, in all kinds of contexts, even atheists have transformative experiences. They just don't attribute that to some religious metaphysics. There are psychological explanations that better explain why people might have thought that certain individuals were resurrected, or why people might believe in certain miracle stories. Psychological explanations like bereavement delusions, which is the phenomena where through intense grief, people have reported interacting with loved ones who had recently died. Right? Phenomena like mass delusions, wishful thinking, mass hysteria, visions, dreams, right? All these, from a naturalistic perspective, have empirical priors, explain the same data, and do so without assuming something that's unobserved, some supernatural event that the theist has to just prefer and reject the more concrete explanations that I'm providing. I'm not sure where I am on time, but so if I'm going over, just let me know. But I will add this as well, that my claim is not that naturalism isn't without flaws or limitations. I think every metaphysical view has issues. My claim is that where naturalism might fall short, theism fails even worse. Speculation is not the same thing as explanatory power. And as far as I can tell, there's nothing about the claims that theism makes for itself that can be shown to not be purely imaginary. I'm not discounting the transformative experiences that religious people attest to. I'm saying that can be better explained in other ways rather than assuming some supernatural thing taking place. Now, he mentioned probability comparisons and Bayesian probability. Well, I think the Bayesian argument can actually work far better for atheism. We could use the argument from low priors. We could say, if a theory with higher probability, if a theory does have higher probability, it's going to be preferable. Again, how do we apply probability to something that lacks empirical priors? I think physicalism very clearly has a higher probability than theism does. Also, the more specific a view is, the more improbable it becomes. As Draper says, theism is a specific type of idealism. This is in the context of philosophy of mind, that is. And as such, it's going to occupy a smaller area of the probability space. And I will end, I don't know, how am I on time? I'm not sure where I'm on time, but I will add this kind of closing sentence to my statement here, is that I would be very skeptical of any worldview which takes the evidence against it and somehow uses it as confirmation for it. I mean, that is essentially dogmatism. And it sounded to me like in Kyle's opening statement, he was saying, well, theism seems to be able to take the criticisms and somehow use those criticisms as further confirmation that it is true. That is very peculiar to me. I don't understand how the evil that we see is more expected from a characterization of a being that is supposed to be perfect, all-loving, all-powerful. The idea that a better world is a world in which there is a kind of suffering that we see in the world, rape, torture, murder, genocide, the Holocaust, that all these things that anybody with moral, seriousness would do what they could to end those evils. That no, we're supposed to believe that God has his reasons to allow for these things to happen, which, by the way, seems to me that it's also contradictory. I mean, if evil is what ought not to happen, and then you're telling me that this is the best world God could have created, now you're saying that these evils actually is what ought to have happened, that this is the best world God could have made. That seems to me to make absolutely no sense. It seems to be contradictory at face value. And it also seems to me that it is stripping away any content that is sensible in the words goodness and evil that we seem to understand when we're doing moral talk. So yeah, I will leave it there. I will just say that I think Kyle and I can probably agree on what these epistemic virtues are. But I hold to the position that naturalism meets this criteria far better than theism does. So I'll leave it there. I'm not sure where I was in time there. But.
No, you still have 7 minutes left. Are you sure you want to relinquish the rest of your time?
Still 7 minutes? I didn't
Yeah.
realize. Well, I'm not sure that I have much else to say. I mean, again, I think that when we look at the explanatory power of these views, I don't see how it is that theism is actually providing explanations. It seems to me that what theism is providing are just so stories. It's providing speculations. It's working backwards. Naturalism is looking at the world as we see it and trying to understand it. Whereas I think that the theism is coming up, constructing a story, and then doing verbal backflips to try to resolve, I think, the very blatant problems with the characteristics that theists want to tell us this God possesses. So I don't see how imagining exontologies, like the mental in addition to the physical, or the spiritual in addition to the physical, ignoring the idea that this perfect, all-powerful, loving being would allow or could create the circumstances for evil that we see in the world. Assuming that, here's one thing I could add, right? In the context of the fine-tuning that was brought up earlier. Low probability events happen all the time. If I take a bag with marbles in it and I throw it on the ground, whatever configuration of marbles ends up being on the ground is in some sense very improbable, but it's also what was going to happen. Like some configuration had to take place, right? This doesn't mean that anything was designed. I don't see how fine-tuning is in any way an argument for God. I actually think that it's an argument against it, because one would think that if God's intention was for life to emerge, that actually the changing of the constants would be irrelevant. We would expect under theism, if again life was the goal, that the changing of the constants would be irrelevant. Life would still emerge, as opposed to being a rare event in the universe. So even on that level, I think fine-tuning is not helpful. It's actually a problem. Why a non-physical being would even require physical constants to begin with, to result in any sort of specific phenomena, doesn't make sense to me. How it is that people in vastly different cultures can have the same experience but interpret it completely different, I think is a problem for arguing the truth of any particular religion. Like I said, I think that all these phenomena is better explained by naturalism, by psychology, by looking at the way in which people work, and the type of things that lead them to having certain positions. I think I will leave it at that. I think I've said enough.
Awesome. Thank you for that, Cease. We'll go into rebuttals now. Those will be 10 minutes long. And just really quick, Meme Lord Monday, right, Cease?
Yes.
Yeah, he just goes, Cease is so base for not buttoning up for the debate.
Yeah, it's really hot in here, so I apologize for the audience.
No, I do it all the time. I'm part of me is planning on showing up to my debate with Dillahunty like that. So, all right, Kyle, I'll put you up, and then as soon as you start talking, I'll start your 10-minute timer. Sound good?
Yep. Okay, so obviously I'm not gonna be able to address everything that was said. I'll address the main points though. So I'm gonna start off with this whole claim that novel predictions are better evidence than just a combination, right? So this is actually a philosophical view. It's called predictivism within the philosophy of science, and there are a lot of problems with this view, just from a purely Bayesian perspective. So I'll just highlight a few of them. So let's consider this. Okay, let's say our hypothesis, just to give you a counterexample to that. So let's say that our hypothesis is that all metals expand when heated. And our backward evidence is that 1,000 metals or pieces of metals were heated. And so the observable evidence, those thousands pieces of metals expanded. Now, of course, the historical evidence is that the hypothesis H was proposed before we observed the evidence E. However, if we try to use Bayes' theorem to calculate this, there's no reason to think that just because we made a novel testable prediction that's actually going to increase probability compared to if we propose a hypothesis afterwards. Because what the predictivists want to claim is that the hypothesis is more probable when we have the hypothesis be conditional on the evidence plus our historical information regarding that. But then, of course, the implication of this would be that it is more probable for the hypothesis that all metals expand when heated have been proposed before the observation was made. But of course, this is very implausible because it suggests that the likelihood of a hypothesis being formulated before observing the evidence is dependent upon the truth of the hypothesis, and that's just invalid Bayesian reasoning. That does not work. So yeah, this whole predictivist model is completely and utterly incompatible with Bayesian confirmation theory. In fact, if you're going to go with the predictivist model as a Bayesian, I would say you're going to run into the old evidence problem, which is we don't have too much time to get into, but basically the old evidence problem would say that that basically any new piece of evidence is not going to be able to increase the probability because of some background information regarding like how probable hypothesis. We can fix this, however, if we adopt what's called an atemporal view of confirmation. So in this case, epicenter probabilities have nothing to do with where and when you made the hypothesis. All that matters is that you can actually accommodate or predict the evidence. Again, I'm using prediction as just a degree of support. I'm not using it in this temporal fashion. So yeah, that's the first major problem that I see here. Now, of course, there's some other considerations. There's some other arguments I could present, but I don't think we have time to get into that right now, at least for this rebuttal. So you mentioned a few things. You also mentioned you equate naturalism to science. So you said, oh, well, naturalism is just, whatever, we're trying to explain phenomena, and we want to make sure that we can basically, what's it called? So like, basically said, oh, we're trying to figure things out, right? Well, the problem is there's no reason to expect this. So first of all, I want to know what you mean by naturalism. That's the first consideration. Maybe we can discuss that in the dialogue. But this whole issue of trying to logically equate naturalism with scientific hypotheses doesn't work, because scientific hypotheses are a completely different domain, right? At the most fundamental level, science tells us how things behave, right? They don't tell us what things fundamentally are. Physics, for example, tells us that matter, mass, and charge, and these properties are completely defined in terms of the ordinary behavior, right? However, physics tells us nothing about the intrinsic nature of matter, right? Furthermore, I think it also runs into Heppel's dilemma issues, right? Because what does it mean to say that everything is physical or natural as opposed to chemical or biological or financial, etc., right? With this understanding, we can't really say that naturalism. We can't really define naturalism as a theory without defining it. And if you're going to define it as just being logically equivalent to scientific hypotheses, well, then you're going to run straight into Heppel's dilemma. So that doesn't work. And that's why, again, I think naturalism is best defined as just the proposition that there are non-intentional, non-normative substances that govern creation and change. I think that is what naturalism is. Maybe you disagree with me on that. We can discuss that. But yeah, this whole idea that naturalism is just logically equivalent to the paradigm of scientific inquiry is just completely, I would say, wrong. You also mentioned fine-tuning near the end. So again, this is confusing physical probabilities with epicenter probabilities. They are not necessarily the same. So when we're talking about the probability of fine-tuning conditional on theism, the reason why we say it's more likely is because from an epistemic standpoint, we would not expect that. Just from an epistemological standpoint, your counterexample doesn't work because that's not talking about epicenter probabilities at all. And what we're concerned with is epistemic probabilities, not physical probabilities. So that doesn't work as an argument. Now, another thing too, just briefly, I want to discuss. You mentioned the mind-body problem. I'm an idealist, so I would say that the mind is basically just what the brain looks like. from a third-person perspective. We can get into that later. You also brought up the problem of evil. So the problem with this is you're relying upon this necessity condition where God has to prevent suffering at all costs. Again, because I operate under a different axiology than I wouldn't necessarily hold to that, I would say that God can allow for suffering as long as it's defeatable, and that we can provide a theological story to accommodate that. Now, you mentioned Draper's little priors argument. I'm not going to get too much into this here, but basically I have a few major problems with this. So the first problem is that you can construct theism as compatible with physicalism depending upon what you mean by God, right? So this whole notion of source physicalism versus source idealism, I don't think works for Draper's argument. But more problematically, I think, is that there's actually counterexamples to Draper's theory. So, for example, consider this. Let's say we have let's say I flip a coin 4 times with a fair coin. And then each, obviously we would say that each of the 4 times that I flip the coin, it has equal probability. The problem is that on Draper's account, you would have to say that more uniform hypotheses are simpler and therefore more probable. Well, I provide a counterexample to that because obviously if I have 2 state descriptions, each with heads, heads, tails, tails, and then the other 2 state descriptions, which is tails, heads, tails, tails, heads, well, you would have to absurdly apply that those latter propositions are less probable. That just doesn't work, given the example I gave. Again, we could discuss this, but I think Draper's little priors argument depends upon a view of coherence or a view of probability that I just don't accept, given those counterexamples. Anything else? So you claim that naturalism explains better with morality. We can get into that in our discussion, but I know. And one last thing. So you mentioned how this is the last thing I'll address, and then I'll close off. So you mentioned how this is just dogmatism, right? So you mentioned how, well, you're trying to accommodate all the evidence, and that's your best. I mean, you didn't say this explicitly, but you basically hinted at like you're cheating. You're not allowing. You're trying to argue that evil is supposed to be evidence for theism. Well, it's like, well, yeah, if we filter it through that transitivity formula that I outlined earlier, then it would be. Of course, it depends on what the intermediate proposition would be, right? And that could be saint making, some kind of educated theodicy, right? So it depends on what that intermediate proposition is going to be. But yeah, I mean, I would say on certain conditions, that's going to be true, and that just follows. And it's not dogmatism, because what we're doing is we're basically saying, hey, even though we might have thought that evil is evidence against theism initially, once we understand the overall larger narrative, then we could actually say, okay, we live in an S world, right? Because again, if we're talking about transitivity, we say that axiological good wholes supports an S world. And if we find ourselves in an S world, then now it's probabilistic it supports theism. I'm not really sure what you mean. So that seems a very ambiguous term. Maybe you can clarify on that. But yeah, those are my main concerns. And oh yeah, one last thing, which is your claim about ontological simplicity. So yeah, what I'm doing, and this is the last thing I'll say. So all I'm doing here is I'm basically saying like, hey, we have this evidence, we have observed data. And so what I'm doing is I'm positing an unobservable entity to explain what we do observe. In this case, the unobservable entity is God. And what I'm saying is that what we observe are good states or axiological relevance, right? And those can take different forms depending on what that looks like. I'm basically just doing what scientists do all the time, in terms of the theoretical structure of how science works. And I'm just applying it. Of course, I'm applying that same logic to theism. And so, yeah, those are my main concerns. I think that this whole predictivism thesis is just completely wrong. We can go back and forth on that if you want. I think that trying to equate naturalism with science doesn't work. I think you're misunderstanding the nature of the fine-tuning argument. I think that the low priors argument that you mentioned doesn't work either, because I gave a counterexample. And yeah, that's basically all I have to say in my rebuttal. So yeah.
Did you have a timer in front of you? Because you stopped like literally on the 0 there.
No.
It's funny. All right. Thank you for that, Kyle. Cece, you ready? You're muted. Just,
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah. Cool. I'll put you up, and then as soon as you start talking, I'll start the timer.
Sure. So a few things. The first thing I want to say is that I completely disagree that what Kyle is doing is applying the kind of the scientific perspective or what scientists do all the time. It may be true that when we start with a hypothesis, there may be, some unobservable things taking place, but the hypothesis is trying to explain things that we do observe, and then eventually it's going to be grounded by observations and certain kinds of evidence. That is precisely not what theism is doing. Theism is creating a story. The idea that we would need something unobservable to explain the observable seems unnecessary and quite problematic. Now, I never said that the naturalism and the scientific method are synonymous. I define naturalism as the idea that everything which exists has a spatial and temporal dimension. Then we use the scientific method to try to explain different phenomena that exist. I also didn't say that novel predictions is somehow my entire framework, right? I used it as one epistemic virtue that I think is a positive one, is a very useful one that science provides, but it's one of many. I didn't say that it was the only approach or that even the most important one. And I didn't really understand your criticisms of it, because again, I don't see where the problem is. I'm not claiming that the only way to arrive at truth or understand reality is through a novel prediction. I'm saying that it is an aspect of our approach that I think is an important one, but not the only one. Now, as far as the fine tuning, again, I didn't really hear a response there. I don't know what you mean by epistemic probability. Again, your view is making extra assumptions, right? If you want to say that the constants that we see in the universe and their so-called fine-tuning requires some non-observable explanation, some tuner, some designer, some mind, right? I'll say it again, that is kicking the can down the road, because you remain with the same problem for God's nature. How is God's nature the way that it is as opposed to being anything else? And if you can't account, or if you're going to say that, well, God's nature doesn't require a tuner, then I would ask the same thing for the universe or reality. Why is it that reality requires a tuner, but not God's nature? I think that my view is a simpler one. It's making less assumptions. Now, even if you want to take the view that, okay, there isn't this duality, you're just an idealist, so you say that everything is ultimately mind, and when we use physical terminology, we're just kind of describing one substance. Again, that's fine, but then it remains strange to me that you will still be speaking about God in a way that's not observable, whereas we observe minds as we observe brains, physical brains. As far as what you said about the problem of evil, yeah, again, if you want to recontextualize the notion of God to be one that allows for evil, you can do that. But I don't understand how all you're saying there is acknowledging what I said earlier, which is you are telling me that the worldview that makes more sense is one in which we call God good, and then we think that this good God allows for genocide, allows for rape, allows for torture, and that it is fine because he'll resolve the problem down the line, right? That ultimately suffering will be resolved in heaven or something like that. I'm not sure what exactly your theistic view is, but I don't see anything you said there as making better sense in the world than the naturalist, who doesn't have to be faced with this question of how could the author of morality allow for these evils, as opposed to the naturalist can say, look, we are the creatures that we have, we have the drives that we have, and some of them are positive, like empathy and friendship and caring about the other. But we also have these negative drives that bring people to doing harm. And this is not surprising from a naturalist perspective, why it is that we would see both the good and the evil in the world. I think it's far more strange if we were to assume that the theistic premise that we see what we see. Yes, of course you can come up with a story to try to make sense of it, but it's going to be a far more complicated story. It's going to be one where you're doing mental gymnastics to explain why a supposedly all-powerful and all-loving God would allow for slavery. It really doesn't add up. Yeah, and as far as I'm trying to remember everything you said there, I was having a little bit of trouble following you a little bit there. I still don't see how it is that you're claiming that theism has more explanatory power and is simpler. Whatever notion of God or theistic framework you want to construct that you think potentially avoid some of the concerns I brought up initially runs into the same problem, which is, how can you show me that your story isn't purely imaginary, isn't purely speculative, right? Isn't making more assumptions than I am, isn't adding extra ontologies or extra, if not ontologies, because I think you said that you're an idealist, at least more questions to account for. Everything about your worldview, I think, explains less, asks more questions, and complicates the problem. It doesn't resolve anything. So, I will have my own time. I don't.
You got about 3 minutes left.
Okay, so I'll add a couple other things. So going back to the fine tuning for a minute. Why should I? And actually, this extends also to other theistic claims, right? Why should I prefer a non-observable explanation for fine tuning versus looking at it as a physical phenomena, right? We don't have other universes to compare this universe to, right? Maybe it could have been different. Maybe it could have not been different. We don't know. We don't have a basis to even talk about probability when we don't have another universe to compare it to. But why assume a non-physical or unobserved explanation as opposed to applying notions like entropy, like the move from order to disorder? Why assume supernatural intervention in the context? Again, I know we're not talking specifically about Christianity, but I'll just use it as an example. Why assume that the better explanation for the spread of Christianity is that there was divine intervention that led to a resurrection, as opposed to accepting observable phenomena like bereavement delusions and all the other observable phenomena that I mentioned earlier? How can you say that one view that is dealing with the unobservable is somehow more likely than my view, which is dealing with the observable? And I'll ask this question. How do you, and I think maybe I asked it earlier, but I don't remember if I did or not in my opening. How do you distinguish between something that is unobservable, outside of space and time, immaterial, and something that does not exist, right? What you said about the low probability, what was it? You said, I wrote it down here somewhere. You said, well, you mentioned the example of the coins, right? 1 minute warning. Okay, great. Well, I wasn't saying that we use the low probability arguments in every context, right? But I'm saying that there's a context in which it makes sense, which I think is useful. And then there may be contexts where that view is exhausted and runs into issues. It doesn't mean that we throw out the utility of the view where it works, right? We can understand where it works and we can understand where it doesn't. It seems to me that you took his view out of context And again, I said it before, I'm okay with recognizing that all views have some limitations. It doesn't mean that we throw them out. So I'll leave it there.
Awesome. Thank you for that, Cease. Cool. I'll set the timer for 40 minutes. And if in the middle of the discussion section, you guys kind of just get to this point where you think there's nothing left to talk about, whatever, we'll just add on extra time to the Q&A. Like I said, I don't think I'll need to get involved or moderate much. I'll jump in if things get really spicy, or if I think like people are talking past each other, I'll jump in. But I'm just gonna leave it to you guys. As soon as somebody starts, I'll let you guys figure out who wants to ask something first or whatever. And then as soon as like there's momentum going, I'll start the timer. Sound good?
Sure.
Be nice. Don't make Dad come in.
Okay, so I don't have a set of questions. I just want to ask this. You mentioned a bunch of these theoretical virtues, and I'm wondering why can't that just be an application of Bayes' theorem?
No, well, I think you can apply Bayesian theorem for both views, right? You can take a Bayesian approach and use that in favor of atheism as well, right? And I think that's what I did in my opening, right?
I agree with that, but the problem is if we use Bayes' theorem, then we're automatically in the realm of epistemic probability. Then we have to ask, well, how much does one hypothesis make another likely? Because that's the definition of epistemic probability, right?
Sure.
So we are dealing with probabilities then. So I was that's why I asked, because I was confused about like if we can agree on that point.
Well, I'm generally skeptical of Bayesian probability as it is, right? Because again, I struggle to understand how we can do probability talk in any credible way that doesn't become a just so story outside of some basis of empirical priors. Now, no, I wasn't clicking, but even if we want to go down that road, I would say we can use Bayesian probability even in an atheistic sense. And then I think ultimately the problem is that it's going to come down to us having different intuitions. You know, we're going to run into this wall where you're going to say that the data is better explained by your view, and I'm going to say that it isn't. And that I just think that that's kind of where we run into at that point.
Okay, so I think the best tiebreaker between those intuitions is going to come down to what the data actually says.
Sure.
Right. Because my view of not just theistic confirmation, but my view of just any confirmation in general is going to involve what's called confirmational holism, where you have to basically, in order to get from the observed data and to make an inference about the unobservable, you're going to need these intermediate steps to get you there. So within a scientific context, these would refer to what's called auxiliary assumptions that you would have to bring to the table. And again, it depends on the context. So if let's say you're trying to test Newton's theory, and you have to assume that your equipment is working properly, you have to assume a certain amount of assumptions about that. Right. So you have propositions about the equipment, and then you have propositions about your theory, and then you have propositions about the observation. Right. So, I mean, we have to do that in science. Right. So what I'm saying is, let's take the logic, not the content, because I think what's happening is you're confusing the content with the structure. I'm not saying that the content of science, or at least the content of like a scientific theory, is going to be relatively similar to theism. What I'm saying is that the structure is going to be the exact same.
I understand. I'm not confusing. I understand your claim. I'm saying that is, I think, demonstrably false. It may be true. First of all, I don't agree with the premise that for science to function, it is making all of these assumptions. There may be cases where it does that to a point, but ultimately, when it's engaging in the observable, even those assumptions, if they don't actually correspond in some concrete way to reality, those assumptions are going to be shown to be flawed or incorrect or problematic. Now, again, as I said in my opening, I can acknowledge that naturalism and physicalism might have limitations. I don't see how that gives credence to the theistic project. My main question for you is the following: how do you show me that your worldview isn't merely speculative and imaginary? How do you show me the difference between an unobserved thing or an unobserved explanation that exists in some sense outside of space and time, and something which does not exist, or non-existence?
Okay, so the issue here is I'm not sure what you mean by speculative and imaginary. Those are very ambiguous terms. So maybe you can define what you mean by that.
Sure. So we see that the constants of the universe are a certain kind of way, and we speculate that the reason why the constants are that way is because they must have been put there with intention, right? I don't see any connection between observing the constants and then making the leap that those constants were set in place through a mind. By imaginary, what I mean is, and also psychologically speaking, I can accept the fact that there are people that have deep, what they would call religious experiences. I don't see how that experience is better explained by some story of or claim that the person is coming into contact with God, as opposed to their psychology being what it is, leading to that experience. What I mean by imaginary is, I can imagine reality being many different kinds of ways. But do I have good reason to think that what I'm imagining is actually corresponding to something concrete? And I don't see the theistic framework as succeeding in that goal. If you tell me you're in contact with God, how do I know that you're not imagining that you're in contact with God?
So there's a few things. So, and I'll get to that question, but you mentioned you can't get from the part, I think it was the particles in the universe or stuff in the universe to God, right? Now, what if?
I'm sorry.
What was your
distracted.
first?
I was reading one of the comments. Can you say that again? I'm sorry.
What was your first? So you first claimed you can't get from what we observe in the world to theism in the sense. And what was the example?
Yeah, I'm saying it seems to me completely speculative to say we observe certain constants in the universe.
Oh, okay, so this is fine tuning.
Yes, I don't see how you make the leap.
Okay, so how you make the leap or make the connection is you ask, okay, does fine tuning have axiological relevance? Is there some value that a perfect being, if it exists, would pursue? Right. And so what you do is you posit that being as your unobservable to explain what you do observe. Just like when we in physics, when we have to posit like neutrinos, for example, to explain what we do observe, like these teeny tiny particles, we have to posit those, which is our theoretical content, to explain what we do observe. It's this process of retroduction. It's the exact same logic of retroduction applies to theism just as much as it does to scientific.
But this is just false, because even if that was true, right? Let's say that was the case. The move from something purely theoretical, like just or something hypothetical, to now this theory is actually having, legs to stand on in the scientific field, is then the evidence that actually ends up confirming these hypotheses, right? That seems to me to be quite different than
No, I don't think it is.
okay, maybe this is going to be a point of disagreement, because I think I think it's very.
It's the exact same structure. So what you have
I don't
to
see how.
you're going to have to show where the structure doesn't align. So where does the structure fall apart?
Yeah, I don't see how proposing certain physical forces, given the type of phenomena we see in the world, and then through experimentation and different tools of science and different technologies, eventually confirming those hypotheses in a
Okay,
concrete
no.
way.
So I think this is your problem. You're not thinking in terms of axiology. You're thinking in something completely different that has nothing to do with the content of theism. What I'm saying is, once you understand how theism makes predictions in an axiological sense, then it's those axiological connections that you can make, and that's how you make the prediction.
No, I
That's what
understand
the
that.
evidence is going to be.
No. I get the framework. What I'm saying is that I have no reason to accept those axioms. It seems to me that, again, and this goes back to what I was saying earlier, right? The entire structure you're providing seems to me to be speculative, based in imagination, and a just so story. Now, if you want to
Okay,
say,
I have a question for you about that. So my question is this: Do you think that value exists in the world? And what I mean by value is not a meta-ethical claim. So I'm not claiming that there's these meta-ethical stance-dependent values that exist, but rather I'm saying, from the perspective of any rationally informed or properly functioning and fully informed, let's say, valuer, okay, from their perspective, would it be the case that there is value in the world in the sense that they want to pursue it? There's goodness in the world. So would you deny that whole
no, so
thing?
let me answer that, but I'll answer a question. I just want to say one thing real quick. Just, and I'll plant this flag on the ground.
Okay.
Look, maybe I would be happy to have you on my podcast to speak with a physicist about some of the things you're saying about science, because I do think, I'm not a physicist, right? But I do think that some of your view of physics, I think, is problematic. But let's say you were right. Let's say that I'm confused about science. Then all I would say there is that what you're pointing to are problems with science. There's nothing about limitations of science that is going to give credence to your project.
I'm not. What do you mean?
Like, if you want to say that the framework that the scientific approach takes is similar or identical with
it is identical.
The theistic structure. Well, I'm saying that it isn't, but let's say that it was.
But why? Oh, okay. Why is it not?
Because, again, I think ultimately they are functioning quite differently. When a scientist is kind of proposing the idea of a neutrino, there's a point in which, for that theory or for that hypothesis to become concrete, is going to require something that is observable, not just the hypothesis. But this is kind of relevant, because let's say that I'll grant what you're saying, and let's say that you're right. All that would point to, for me, is that actually science has certain problems, and science having limitations does not give credence to now the project of theism being successful. I just got to say one thing about one of the comments, dark matter. There are theories that I think are far better than proposing dark matter. I think dark matter has a lot of issues there. Now, you asked me about value.
Yeah.
Value, from my understanding, from my worldview, is an emergent action or perspective that comes about from consciousness existing, right? So I don't think there is like inherent value in the universe outside of the minds which exist in the universe that construct value, whether you mean value in some sense of like existential value, or value in looking at certain things having certain functions. But it's not that there is like value independent of minds.
I never claimed that.
Okay, no, I'm just clarifying.
I take a stance-dependent view of value, but my point is, the reason why I asked that question is because all the evidence for and against theism is going to come down to a question of what do you find valuable, right?
Sure.
And so my point is that when you connect propositions about value, and in this case, a value would be something that has axiological relevance, right? So basically, my view is basically that any fully informed and fully functioning creature would pursue something that's good, and that them having the motivation to pursue that's not what gives it value, but that would be evidence for its value, right? So that's what makes it valuable in this kind of, again, it's a dependent view.
That's right.
So the issue is, well, we can let's just apply that to theism, right? So let's say we have a being that's all powerful, all knowing, and all good, right? Well, the only thing that being would be motivated to do is to pursue value, to create a world with value, right? What I'm saying is, like, that's when I would say that God creates a world, so he doesn't necessarily, like, he's not like, I don't think God is like involved in every single cause and effect that happens. I would hold to kind of disjunctive model of that. But anyways, so the point is, like, God would totally value what's called an S-type world, right? That's what God values. That's what God creates, right? An S-type world. And so then the only question is, well, if that's what God is going to pursue, then the evidence for theism is going to be, well, what evidence do we have that we actually live in an S-type world? What I'm saying is that, given the different kinds of evidence like consciousness, fine-tuning, those kind of things, because they have axiological relevance, because they're valuable, then that's going to be evidence for us living in an S-type world, which then would be evidence for theism.
No, this to me seems, and you might say the same thing for my view, but it seems to me that this is just confirmation bias, right? Like, I could say, look, everything from fine-tuning to moral values to existential values to consciousness, naturalism can attest to, right? Naturalism has an explanation and an account for all the same data, right?
Okay, so let me
just finish up. Sorry. The difference is I'm postulating less ontologies, right? I can explain value from a naturalistic perspective without having to assume that there is a God motivated in a certain kind of way, or whose nature is a certain kind of way, that will create a world in a certain kind of way. This is what I meant earlier by saying, you're saying, well, if this particular God exists, then he would create this particular world. And so when we see certain things in the world, we take that to be evidence that that particular God exists. But why? I could say all these things, all these observations can also exist in a world in a universe where God doesn't exist. These observations can be explained in naturalistic terms, in terms that can be observed in a far more concrete way than proposing these extra ontologies.
Okay, so let me try to understand what you're saying. So what you're saying is that you think that naturalism can predict what we see better.
Yes.
Did I get that right?
Yes.
Okay, then. So let's get into that. So I have one question for you. How do you know? How would naturalism predict that we live in a world that we're deceived? Let's say, like, I don't know, like, or maybe you can define what you mean by naturalism first, and then we can get into what it predicts. So how would you define naturalism?
So I would say that naturalism is the view, again, there are different interpretations, but my kind of take is that what we observe, what is real has a spatial and temporal dimension, and that the way to sort of separate the purely imaginary from the actual is, we use empiricism for that. Again, I'm not a strict empiricist, but that is, I think, a useful tool to at least ground some of his claims as being more concrete than others. Yeah, and even where you might say, well, maybe naturalism doesn't predict X, Y, or Z, I think it explains X, Y, or Z in a more concrete way than theism can produce.
Okay, so you claim that naturalism is just the proposition that all that exists is physical space-time, right? Okay, so what about naturalistic views that don't imply that? So there's this view called atemporal monism, or you could say, if you take a many world interpretation of quantum physics, there's worlds. There's the wave function, the universal wave function that's outside of space and time. So like this whole notion that everything that exists is within the spatial temporal domain, that has been completely. Yeah, I'll stop my pen. Sorry. That has been completely just so not true by what we know from physics.
That is a bold claim right there. Look, a couple of things. One, I obviously completely disagree with that, what you just said. I don't think physics has undermined that idea at all. In fact, I mean, I just finished a podcast a week ago talking about how physicists seem to think of space-time as an actual substance, not as just some kind of abstract notion. But look, I mean, you're right in one sense that like you can be an atheist and believe in abstract objects. You can be a naturalist and take a slightly different interpretation than the one I've offered. You asked for my view of naturalism. I'm not saying that it's the only or exhaustive view of naturalism. I'm saying that again, there is nothing about theism that succeeds where different interpretations of naturalism fail. That's my point, is that I can acknowledge and I can agree with you, even just for the sake of the argument, that science might have limitations, that naturalism might have limitations. Fine.
Well, fine.
That does not give justification that the theism, that doesn't give
All right,
justification of theism.
Let's concede that point. Let's say I am wrong about that claim, right? That still doesn't explain. Okay, so here's my question to you then, given your views. How would we not find ourselves in a world where it just seems like there's a God, that we're just deceived to believe that there is a God rather than not?
Wait, I'm sorry, I didn't understand the question. Can you ask it again?
So my question to you is, how would we expect there to be a world where we're just deceived to believing that there's a God, like we visually perceive it there, but yet it's not actually there? Like, how would your hypothesis make that scenario less plausible?
I mean, look, we can all be solipsists, right? And say, I mean, I would say the only thing I can be certain of is that I exist, right? But I'm not demanding certainty from the theist perspective, right? I'm asking for some level of concrete evidence that would raise the probability that certain claims are corresponding to reality. Yeah, you could always say, even if we saw God, maybe we could be under some delusion, right? You could always have.
Well, I'm asking what would undercut that scenario for being the case on your view.
Yeah, well, we for one, we could say what reasons. Look, we can construct a endless list of what ifs, right? The question becomes, do I have good reasons to actually take any of these possibilities as realistic, right? Do I have good reasons to think that if I am talking with you right now, that you are a figment of my imagination? I would say no, you could be, but in my phenomenological experience of you, what I understand to engage in life and engage in the outside world, I have pretty good reasons to think that this is really happening right now. That if God came down to us in a way that was globally observable, in some sense that would be stronger than just somebody's internal feelings or state of mind, that would be more believable than something that's not even observed at all, right? So I give an example, because theists always ask me, what will be evidence for me to believe in God, right? And I give this example. If through prayer to a specific God, in an organized setting, with where it's not just me, but I'm there with like a team of scientists, I was to pray for a purple flying turtle to materialize in front of me from thin air, and then that actually took place, and this new creature that had never been observed before in nature remained in existence, right? And we, videotaped it, right? We had a way to sort of ground this experience in more concrete, observable ways. This would at least be the beginning of some concrete approach to justifying some of the claims of theism. Now, somebody could say, who wasn't there, could say, well, this was fabricated, like the video wasn't real.
Okay, you're
Or
not
somebody could
answering my
say,
question. You're going
Go ahead.
on and on, but you're not answering my question.
How am I not?
My question was, what would predict against that scenario, conditional on your theory of naturalism?
What would predict against what? That we could be deceived?
That we'd be deceived to believing that there's a God out there.
Well, I'm not saying that there's something necessarily that will predict against it, but we could ask the question, given what we seem to understand about our reality and our experience of it, are we justified in believing?
Now you're saying, oh, it's my theory plus my background knowledge, and that's not what I'm concerned with. I'm asking conditional on your theory of naturalism, not everything else we know, just antecedently.
Mm-hmm.
How would we predict against that actually occurring? Like, what exactly is naturalism doing to make predictions?
Yeah, so like I said, it is going to be grounded in the experience of the world that we have, right? So based on what we understand, for example, about visions or delusions, we have ways to test whether or not one's experience of the world, who doesn't have schizophrenia, versus somebody who does, who could be deceived that God is talking with them in that moment. Right? We have ways to compare and contrast what is going on in these people's brains when they're having these different experiences. Now, if you're asking that, could I be certain from the naturalist perspective that I couldn't be deceived?
By the way, I'm not asking for certainty. I'm a fabulist, so I wouldn't.
Yeah, but that's kind of the approach I'm taking, right? I'm saying I'm not claiming that my view can predict that I couldn't be deceived, right? It's possible I could be deceived.
Wouldn't you agree there needs to be some difference in degree of probability in order for your theory to actually make any useful predictions?
Yeah, and I think that my theory does. I think that my theory does account for, again, going back to sort of what we were saying earlier. I think probability talk to be far more meaningful in a context of empirical priors, because outside of that context, it seems to me that we sort of end up making up our own.
So you're an empiricist, right?
No, not a strict empiricist, no. But I do think that it's a useful tool. I'm not a strict empiricist.
Okay, so I have a question for you then, just to push back a little bit. Do you see matter? Like, do you you see it everywhere? Is that you have this direct acquaintance with the existence of matter?
My understanding is that, well, again, it depends on what specifically you mean by matter. My understanding is that in some sense, yes, in some sense, clearly there are particles and certain behaviors of the world
right.
that we don't have.
You have phenomenological experience of the existence of matter, but the concept of matter as being something that's beyond experience or independent of consciousness, that's just an interpretation that you've attached to it.
No, but I'm not making so again, the aspects of matter that are not observable to us with our bare eyes have been observable to us by more complex tools of science. Now, I'm not a physicist, right? I'm not gonna be an authority on how science and technology operates here. If you want to have that conversation, we can have that conversation with.
Well, the reason why I asked this question is because I don't think you can be a radical empiricist and a materialist. I think those views don't work together. I think you would need to, in order to say like, oh well, all that I'm going to believe is what we observe. Well, all I observe are my phenomenological states, right?
But I
Now,
can
of
be a
course, we both
physical.
agree. I mean, we both agree that there is an external world, right? But the question is, what's the nature of that? What I'm saying is, why posit something that's beyond? So, I mean, this is going to go. I don't want to get too off topic here. But my point is that, well, I think we both are positing unobservable entities to explain what we do observe, and so that brings us back to the initial conversation we had earlier.
No,
Because you're
I
a
don't think that's what I'm
materialist.
doing. I don't think I'm positing anything in principle unobservable.
Yes, you
Uh,
are.
where?
Yes, you are. You're
Which one?
positing the existence of mind independent matter that
Mind?
exists beyond our phenomenological experience. That's what you have to do as a materialist.
Wait, you're saying as a materialist, you're saying materialists are positing mind independent matter?
Yeah.
I don't know why you would think that.
I mean, that's I mean, maybe you have a different definition of what materialism is, but that's sort of the understanding.
That is definitely not how I understand it. From my perspective, the physicalist is saying that mind is ultimately some configuration of matter. Right now, I agree that there are questions there. Like I take the hard problem of consciousness seriously, and in some sense, I don't think any worldview resolves it in a way that is very what's the word I'm thinking of? Sufficient or satisfactory. But no, I'm not positing that wouldn't make any sense, right? If I'm a physicalist and I think that everything is ultimately reducible to the physical, I'm not going to think that mind is going to be something separate from that, right? I don't view that to be the case. I view mind as an emergent feature of matter being configured in a certain kind of way. If you want to ask me, why is it that in that particular configuration, the phenomenon of mind emerges? I don't know. I'm
No,
fine.
I don't think you really understand what I'm saying. So what I'm saying is that all we know, what we observe, are phenomenological experiences. We observe taste, color, smells, right? What the materialist has to do is they have to extrapolate and say, hey, there's this thing out there that doesn't have sound, color, sensations, etc. Right? And so this is an unobservable entity that I have to posit to then explain my experiences. Now you can do that, that's fine, but you're still positing an unobservable in that scenario.
I don't see.
Every metaphysical theory has to posit an unobservable, unless you want to be like a complete and utter solipsist. That's the only way you can really do it. Other than solipsism, you're gonna have to posit some kind of unobservable.
I don't see why that's the case. I don't see how. Like you may look. I'm not claiming. Again, I don't think you're suggesting this, that any metaphysical view is going to lead us to like some kind of certainty about what is actually the case. So if by unobservable you mean that we don't have an experience that the physical is all there is, right? Oh, okay, sure. Right. I'm not claiming that we do. I'm saying that it is a more reasonable position to take given the available tools and data that we do have. I'm not making a claim to certainty, right? And I'm certainly not positing. I completely disagree with your analysis. I'm not positing some unobservable, immaterial things that explains other things. I'm saying I take this metaphysical view based on what I think is the more concrete approach, the theory that has that embraces the most or the more epistemic values, and I view that as preferable. I'm not making. I don't think I'm doing what you're saying I'm doing.
Okay.
It might be better to just move on because I think we're just
Yeah.
kind of talking past each other at this point.
Yeah. Was there anything else you wanted to get into before we close?
If you don't have anything, Cease, I think one of the. Oh, go ahead, please.
Actually, I do have one question that I don't think was answered, and then we can move on.
Yeah, that's fine.
Can you provide me with the differentiation between something that is non-physical, right, unobserved, but still exist, and something outside of space and time, versus non-existence. Where is the breaker there? Where is the difference that would justify not believing that this unobserved thing you're positing simply doesn't exist?
Yeah, so it's going to depend upon the what the nature of that thing is. So you can, I think that again, like I mean, this might just come back to our previous disagreement. I think that every metaphysical theory is going to have to posit some unobservable entity. Now, you could say, well, maybe the properties of that entity are controversial, and this is why, in my rebuttal, I mentioned how, I mean, for example, like I said, I never mentioned that God was supernatural or immaterial. So I don't need those terms. I leave the question open as to what those properties are, because I can take, for example, I can take an atemporal monistic view and just say that God is just an atemporal wave function that's all powerful and acts on the basis of axiological reasons, and it would still go through. It would still be, it would still work within that kind of framework.
I would need sort of clarification on what you mean by every one of those terms, right? I don't know what you mean by God being a wave function.
What I'm saying is that you don't need to posit God as some like supernatural. You don't need the supernatural in order to. You could naturalize God in that kind of way. You don't need to posit him as immaterial or anything like that.
Okay, great.
Right.
So, great. So if you're positing that actually God isn't this immaterial, unobservable thing outside of space and time, and it has a physical reality.
Well, I mean, let's go back to your view. So let's say that, and maybe this is, I'm going to try to do Rasmussen move on this. So let's say, okay, all that exists is space and time. Well, okay, then let's just get rid of the arbitrary limits. What expects us to think that space and time is something that has, limitations? Maybe there's other universes out there, right? Maybe, and so this whole notion that, oh, well, I'm going to posit like space and time as like this substance, right? Well, I mean, what if space and time like is omnipotent, right? What's preventing that?
I don't know so again, I don't see how one connects ideas of omnipotence or mind or intentions to something that we have no reason to assume has intentions, or again, I don't know what in this context we
because I could take your exact same view and just say, hey, this thing has, in fact, there are certain neo-theistic models that say, for example, that God is time, right? There are literal theists out there that argue that. Now, of course, I don't hold that view, but there are theists out there that do that. So, okay, well, if you view God as time, well, you can just view him as space and time, given what we know from special relativity, or not special, general relativity, given that space and time are pretty much one and the same. And so then all you need to do as a theist is just remove the arbitrary limits and just say, hey, this thing is omnipotent. And what explains why we exist in our kind of universe is because those are the axiological reasons that God has. Right? There's no difference.
But there's a huge difference, because for it to be a theistic perspective, you also have to add the extra ontology there, that this thing has a mind, right? That it has intentions.
Not necessarily. I mean,
so if you're not doing that, then you might be saying, well, even the theist does that to a degree. If you're saying that all you mean by God is nature, well, then we actually have the same view. You're just calling it God while I'm calling it nature. That to me is not actually a significant difference. I'm saying again, and I don't know what you mean by omnipotence in a context, or what you would mean by power, unless you're just talking about like causal power. But if your God doesn't have a mind or intentions or desires or design, then everything you're saying is compatible with atheism.
there are certain classical theist models, for example, that will explicitly state that God does not have a mind in the same way that we would.
And I would respond to that by saying that everything in that view is compatible with atheism. That you would just it become a semantic dispute, which I think is far less interesting. I do want to respond to some of these comments, so maybe we can
Yeah,
get
that's fine.
to the Q&A.
Yeah,
So,
if we can get a Q&A, we can.
If you want to, if you guys think you're done, we can just go into the Q&A.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, just before we do that, everybody start sending in your questions. We already have some to go in, and again, super chats are more than welcome. We'll prioritize those. And just really quick too, I just really want to thank you guys for the fun discussion.
yes, thank you.
It was
Yeah.
probably really fun for the audience to listen to that.
I kind of wish we had judges, just because I'm curious to see what people would have thought about. You know,
I think
how
I
this
can.
would play
I
out.
think I can. Well, you know what? That's probably not a good idea because my audience is probably a little biased.
Yeah.
Yeah, don't do it.
I don't want to do that actually.
No.
But yeah, I mean, like, hey, well,
Before-
I think you guys have both won in my eyes. So okay, so we can start with some of these questions. And again, people, you guys can start asking questions in the comments. I'll try to keep track of the new ones. And a lot of these are aimed towards UCs, but some of these are also questions that I think Kyle could answer. The first one. So, what naturalistic theories of mind do you find compelling?
What naturalistic theories of mind? So I would say that I'm currently, I would say, a non-reductive physicalist. What I mean by that is that I believe everything is ontologically physical, and so I believe the mind is ultimately just another physical phenomenon. But I view language as always having, there's this distance in principle between the description and the thing it's describing, not because there is some difference in its nature. I think we can ultimately describe things in physical terms all across the board, but because there is both a linguistic and subjective limitation that we run into when engaged in the conversation about what is mind, what is consciousness. I agree with, I'm sure people have heard the paper called what's it like to be a bat, right? Where the author accurately explains how we can know all the mechanics, physically speaking, of a bat, and it will not give us its subjective experience. I agree with that view, but not because reality isn't ultimately all physical, but because there are these subjective and linguistic limitations that take place where, to some degree, I'm skeptical about any view resolving the hard problem of consciousness. Again, not because I don't believe that it's all ontologically physical, but because to me the question doesn't make sense. It's like saying, we can be driving in a car while simultaneously observing ourselves outside of the car. I think in principle it fails to work. I'm not a property dualist, but I am sympathetic towards property dualism. I think the more accurate view from our term is a non-reductive physicalist. But again, I go back and forth.
Kyle, did you want to chime in there at all?
Yeah, so I mean, depends on what you mean by naturalistic. I mean, I think classical reductionism is false. I think that if I were a physicalist, I would definitely be in Ceasetoknow's camp on the non-reductive physicalist view. I'd probably adopt some. There's one view. It's interesting. I forgot who the author was, but there's a book called How Mind Makes Matter or something along those lines. And basically, the author proposes that the mind is just the mind is just extrinsic properties. So that's the kind of view that I would go with, or something like that, some kind of emergent dualist perspective. Because I think that substance dualism has a lot of problems. I wouldn't go there. So yeah, definitely in the monist camp there.
Cool.
I'm also a monist, just from from a physical perspective.
Yeah.
All right, just really quick. Thank you, Amdir, for the super chat. Very, very thankful for that, and I was glad to host. And again, yeah, season Alex, I guess is your name. Kyle, good job.
I wish I remember there was this comment earlier. Somebody was trying to troll me, and I wish I remember what it was because I wanted to respond to it, but I can't remember.
If you figure out what it was, you're more than welcome to. Just let me know what it was.
So far.
But also just ignore the troll comments. Like if you're reading the comments, you also see me just telling people to shut up and stop being trolly because
No, it doesn't affect me. I just thought it was funny.
it's annoying. Existential asks, what would give credence to theism if fine-tuning were true? Wouldn't the better explanation be agency over sheer chance?
So I potentially, in a way that may be controversial, take the fine-tuning to be a problem for theism. I take it to be an argument against theism. Because as I said before, I think if the expectation under theism is that God intended for life to emerge, right, then I would expect the configuration of the constants to be completely irrelevant. I would expect that no matter how you change the constants, life should still emerge, right? I also don't think that the fine-tuning is a very convincing argument because we don't have other universes to compare anything to. I would just say that, yeah, I don't. Oh, sorry. The question was, what would give credence to theism? No, even if theism was true, I think the fine-tuning would be surprising. Would be surprising under that view. But what I think would give more credence for me for theism would be the example I gave earlier. Would be if prayer was answered in a very specific way, from a specific God in a very specific way. That would be convincing to me.
Awesome, thank you. I think this is a question for Kyle, not Dwight Schrute. But the God would merely, he said this in a context, but the God would merely index that good to whatever its understanding of good is. How do we get access to that? Okay, so I think what the question's asking Kyle here is like, if there is a God and he's creating worlds that are good, how do we have this epistemic access to what God would perceive as good or valuable, and make sure that lines up with what we think is good or valuable?
Well, I mean, two things. So number one, I think from God's perspective, he's all knowing, so he would be infallible in that case. And so he would already know what's the good. Now, in terms of how we access that good, I think there's kind of two ways to do it. First way is to basically like just see what we can all agree is good. That's where we can start off at. And then we go into asking the question, well, if I'm fully informed, or at least properly informed and properly functioning, and if I have motivation to pursue it, because that's kind of my view, it's a motivational internalist view of value. And so as long as you're motivated, internalized to pursue it, then that's at least some evidence, right? So of course you're not going to have certainty, right? You're never going to get certainty because I'm a fallibilist. But yeah, so you do that. That's one kind of way you can do it. Another way you could do it is to, look at the data of the world. So I know we didn't get too much into this, but like my kind of entire perspective on this is like to take theism, take our axiological assumptions, and we can treat both of them. We can treat that as like a theoretical content. And then we look into the world and it's like, okay, well, given these unobservables, what can I predict? Well, I'll predict this and this, right? And then that's what we find, right? So it's this process of retroductive inference that I would be operated on in regards to that. So that would be my response to that question.
Awesome, thanks. Cease, did you want to add in anything to that? You muted.
I think that how would I say this? I guess I'll say this. I'm skeptical to whether or not these kind of retroactive approaches become more than just a just so story. I think that maybe there are contexts in which that can be fine. I don't think that it makes sense to me in the context of the conversation, in the context of justifying theistic claims.
Fair enough. All right. Castaneda Music asks, Cease, is naturalism observable?
Is naturalism observable? I'm not sure I understand the question. If what he means, or if what they mean is, can I be certain of the metaphysical naturalism? No, I never claimed that to be the case. Doesn't mean that I am assuming some non-physical entity, right? I'm saying, given the available tools, and like I was saying earlier, epistemic virtues that we can compare and contrast worldviews, what worldview is making less assumptions? What worldview is simpler? What worldview has better explanatory power? What worldview makes more predictions? I think naturalism and atheism, well, atheism isn't really a worldview, but naturalism, physicalism, I think, do better in all those categories than theism.
All right. Kyle, did you want to add anything, or?
Yeah, I mean, my response would be no. It's not observable. It's you have to posit unobservables in order to explain what we do observe, and that's exactly what we do in science. That would be my only response.
Okay. I don't know who this is aimed towards, but why do the majority of atheist philosophers of religion, such as Paul Draper, Graham Oppie, et cetera, believe that theism can explain and make predictions? And I don't know who that's aimed to.
I think it's probably aimed at me. Well, I don't think that I said that it can't make any predictions. I think I'm skeptical of the way in which it makes predictions in general. But I can't speak for what other people think, right? And I love Oppie, right? But I mean, I don't necessarily. That's a question for them. I would say I'm more skeptical of the capacity of theism to do these things than maybe someone like Oppie. He might be right, but again, even if I was to concede that theism can make some predictions or has some explanatory power, I don't think that it has those things in a way that is better than naturalism.
Kyle, you got anything?
Not much. I mean, obviously, I would agree with these philosophers. At least on this point, I would disagree with them on whether naturalism does any better. Especially, I think Draper's work is the best on that. So I would actually recommend. Actually, Cease, here's my recommendation to you. I think you should read Paul Draper. I think if you read him, I think you can increase the credence of your atheism. Just a recommendation I have.
Sure.
I love Draper.
Yeah.
Draper's. People always talk up. On the off chance Oppie is watching this, I love you. But
yeah,
I consider Draper like the go-to person on this stuff. All right. Kiefer Cease, what predictions does naturalism make, and how do they render the data more expected than theism?
Yeah, again, so I would say that it is consistent to say that when all that I think we have an experience of is the physical world, that explanations that would attest to understanding the physical world would relate back to the physical. As far as how do they render data more expected in theism, as I was saying earlier, I think the existence of evil is far better explained in naturalistic terms than proposing a God with the characteristics that I've heard that God be described. I think the existence of the way in which we observe the natural world to function, I think makes much more sense under a naturalist perspective. How could a perfect being create an imperfect creation? Right? Well, my view bypasses all those problems. It says, no, we can explain why there are abnormalities when looking at biology without having to then construct other narratives like the idea of sin or Adam and Eve or all these things that you're adding far more specifics there.
Kyle, you got anything?
Yeah, so I think when it comes to this question, and I'm not going to respond to C's because this isn't the dialogue, but
Yeah.
my response to the question would be, I think naturalism does make predictions, and that's going to be in the realm of suffering. So I think Paul Draper has done excellent work of showing this. So I think that when you conjoin naturalism with our background knowledge, then it's going to predict suffering because of its, because naturalism is the hypothesis of indifference, where reality is fundamentally indifferent towards value. Well, suffering is kind of evidence for that, just from a Bayesian perspective. So I will grant that. That's why I always say, like, hey, like, I think that suffering is evidence for naturalism. It's just whether theism can better account for it or not, which I think it can ultimately. But yeah, I mean, I think that naturalism does make predictions. I think it's going to be in the realm of suffering. As far as the other stuff, not too much. I think outside of the data of suffering, I think there's a lot of problems with naturalism making predictions in other areas. Again, it depends upon which hypothesis you go with. So yeah, that's all I have to say in response to the question.
I just want to ask, Kyle,
Yeah.
are you interested in coming on my podcast and kind of unpacking some of your views about science? I think that would be interesting.
Sure. Yeah.
I'll send you a private message after.
Okay.
All right, we got a few more left. Question for Kyle, and this will be two things. Can you define value again? And if it involves well-functioning or perfectly rational agents, can you also explain what those terms are defined in terms of irreducible normativity?
So I'm not really sure. Basically, the idea is any properly functioning, well-informed person, would properly function mean like you have the ability to discern things. You're not, you don't have like any cognitive like limitate or cognitive deficiencies. And then you're well-informed, meaning like you're true propositions, right? Then for any person that is that, because they're a valuer, then they're going to value something on the basis of motivation. Now, again, this is just one view. There's plenty of other views out there in regards to what value is. I would have to look more into that. I'm not sure about irreducible normativity because I'm not really sure what that's supposed to mean. I mean, I don't hold to a stance independent view of value. I hold to a stance dependent view. So I don't know if it would be irreducible in that kind of way. But yeah, I mean, I guess irreducible in the sense that I think that value is irreducible, meaning you cannot really explain it in terms of something that's non-valuable or a-valuable. But anyways, that's all I have to say.
Did you want to add anything?
Yeah, again, I think that concepts like value, meaning, morality, all these things, I think that are not problems for naturalism whatsoever. I think that naturalism can attest to those things, and I think it can explain the existence of those things in a way that is far more concrete than theism. That's my view.
All right, we got a few more left. I'm going to try to triage these, unless you guys just want to keep going.
I do have to end this shortly. So.
Okay, cool. I'll just try to go for some more detailed ones then quick. Okay, so I know Odessa asked for Ceasetoknow, I'm assuming is CTK. Says we can't posit an unobserved for the fine tuning, but for things like dark matter, he says we observe the effects of, so we can posit it. But that's the same argument being made in fine tuning. So why the double standard? I think that's what he's saying.
No, so this is wrong for a number of reasons. Number one, my claim is that the so-called effects that somebody might say is coming from God, I think can be better explained by alternative theories that are more concrete. That's why I said earlier when I mentioned different psychological phenomena that is well documented and attested to. Second, I don't think the dark matter is actually a very convincing theory. I actually did an episode on my YouTube channel about a year and a half ago with a physicist that proposes a theory that I think is far more concrete and has far more evidence behind it than dark matter. So I don't take dark matter to be a good explanation ultimately. But what I mean by far more concrete is, how would I say this? An explanation that can be grounded in observable phenomena. For example, if I have the options, right, between believing in a resurrection or believing in that somebody might think that somebody resurrected because of a bereavement delusion, I'm going to think that the bereavement delusion is going to be a more concrete explanation than the resurrection. That's kind of what I'm trying to say here.
Awesome. Unless you have something to say, Kyle, I'm just gonna move on for time.
Okay. Yeah, no. Continue.
All right.
I know, Cease, you have to go. Is there like all the questions that go to Cease? I think we should do those first.
Yeah. How much time you got left, Cease?
About 5 minutes.
Okay, cool.
Any questions to me you can skip for now.
Yeah. Just trying to find like the good ones. There's really no good ones left. So,
Okay.
This last one we can give Cease is this one. Don't worry about that extra stuff. I asked him to rephrase this question. Do the methodologies of science make any claims towards what reality is, as opposed to how reality behaves?
Do the methodology of science? I'm not sure what the distinction is between what reality is versus how reality behaves. I have no problem acknowledging that, we're going to be limited in principle in how much we can confidently say is true, right? I think tools like science and philosophy are very useful in, I think, getting us closer to truth. But I would never claim that science provides us with like certainty. I think it provides us with good justification. Whether you take a fallibilist view or a foundationalist view or whatever, and we apply our epistemology in relationship with the scientific method, I think we can come up with a pretty good picture of how we think reality seems to operate. My concern, and I've spoken about this in a number of different podcasts, is when science becomes so counterintuitive that I'm concerned about what it is that it's expressing when it makes certain observations. I spoke with a physicist about 2 months ago who took a different understanding of space and time and viewed space and time as possibly not being fundamental to reality. Well, I don't know what that means, right? So, and I think that there's a communication issue between science and philosophy that I think needs to be addressed. And so I have concerns there. So I'm not, but again, I would say there's no limitation of science that gives credence to theism. I just want to address this thing about this. It seems to me that Ceasetoknow contradicted himself earlier when he disputed a scientist don't posit unobservables to explain data. So again, I don't have an issue with the idea that maybe they're doing that when it comes to hypothesis, right? I'm saying when we go to the stages of the scientific method, and then a hypothesis becomes a theory, that we're doing something far more precise than positing unobservables. Now, if I'm wrong about that, and it does posit unobservables in a way that is comparable to theism, I would take that to be a problem for the science as well. But I do think that science also offers so much more in the way that it does what it does, that I don't think theism succeeds in. So I'll leave it there.
All right, last question for Cease, and then we'll switch over to some for you, Kyle. Key for Cease, does he think matter is mind independent or mind dependent?
No, I think that mind is an emergent feature of reality. I'm not saying that. Now, our perception of reality is mind dependent, but reality as a whole doesn't require the mind to perceive it to exist. Yeah, I don't. But that, I think, is how would I say this? I can deduce that from my experience of the world to some degree. Now, one thing James said, the scientific method rests in philosophical principles, which are not observed, but must be posited a priori. James, I would also love to have you on my channel as well, because I think I would question that to some degree. So.
I have one question to Ceasetoknow. Are you a logical empiricist, or I know logical empiricism is a kind of like the contemporary term, but like, are you a logical positivist?
No, I think I'm
Okay.
pretty skeptical of a lot of epistemology, which I think bothers people, right? But I think even in my skepticism, I still hold naturalism to be preferable.
All right, Cease, if you want to get going, you can get going if you want to, or if you want to stay while Kyle answers, you can. I really appreciate your time, though.
I want to say thank you, Than, for having me on your channel. I want to say thank you for Kyle for engaging in the conversation. I've definitely loved to have both of you on my show at some point when you have the time, when you're free. Thank you for the audience, for your questions, and yeah, I'm sure that I will talk to you all again sometime soon. So
yeah, thanks for coming on.
Thank you for giving me this chance.
And like I said, hit me up after my debate with Dale Hunty when
Absolutely
things slow down.
Yeah, take care, guys.
All right, Kyle. Sorry about all the coughing, everybody.
Yeah, how many questions do I got?
I'm just gonna give you 2.
Okay.
All right. So this was a follow up from the same guy's question for Cease, just to you now. Yeah. Could you ask Kyle if he thinks a strict scientific materialism reduces to pan-dispositionalism?
I don't even know what that is. I don't even know what that's a new term, so I can't answer the question.
I'm wondering if that's like a type of
I gotta be completely honest. I've looked into a lot of terms. That is not a term I know.
I know. When I'm looking at the term, it makes me feel it like what I'm intuitively getting out of that is something like some kind of like panpsychism, like panpsychistic axiarchism.
Yeah, I don't know, because I would
or
have
maybe it's like the universe has some kind of disposition towards.
Okay, so yeah, so if I take like Alexander Malpass's dispensationalism, disposition, so like reality has a disposition towards things.
Yeah, like he's talking horse objection.
Okay, well, if you're going to talk about a pan dispositionalism,
he says all properties are dispositions. Is like
the problem with that is that makes no predictions whatsoever. Like, I don't even know what kind of like, there's no way to test a hypothesis, because the problem with there is if you have a hypothesis that predicts literally everything, well, there's no way to like constrain it. So
all right, cool. Next question. Well, last one too. Kyle, I got a question. Does God want to maximize valuable agents or value that agents will find? If God wants to maximize valuable agents, would God create an infinite number of valuable agents?
Well, I mean, I don't really see why that's I mean, I would say he wants to do both. So, yeah.
Would that entail that he would create an infinite number of them?
I have to think about that. I don't know. I mean, it depends on like what the characteristics of an S4 would be. I could see someone making an argument for that. So yeah, I would say God wants to maximize valuable agents and make sure that agents value other things, right? I don't know if it would entail an infinite number of valuable agents. Again, I'll have to think about that. But I do think, if you want to talk about like infinity, I do think theism makes a multiverse highly likely. So
Cool.
yeah.
All right, Kyle. Well, with that, we'll call it a night.
Oh, by the way, Christian James, I am a classical theist. So yeah, sorry, we're in the same camp.
I purposely didn't bring that up because I figured you guys can talk privately if you want to. Cool. Well, thank you everybody for coming to listen, Kyle. Thanks again for jumping on and doing the debates.
Yep.
You have another one with Tim and some others coming up on this channel.
Yeah, next week. Yeah, hopefully we'll see.
So I'll announce that to everybody a little later once we finalize some things. Yeah. And then Kyle, send me your blog and I'll put it in the description of the video so people can come and look at your written stuff. Cool.
No problem.
Thank you everybody for listening. God bless. Until next time.